2016. Identity politics has trumped development politics in India. Comment. 2015. Account for rise of regional political parties and assess their role in contemporary India. 2015. Comment on marginalization of the left ideolo in India 2014. Standard introduction. A political party is a group of people who come together to contest elections and hold power in the government. They perform the most essential input function of interest aggregation. Edmund Burke defines political parties as a group of people with a shared ideology for the pursuit of a common interest. Party system is the lifeblood of democracy. Political parties are the vehicles through which that electorate exercises its right to participate in the political process. MS. Gore, a healthy party system is essential for a democratic polity. It provides the necessary link between the citizen and the government and ensures that the latter is accountable to the former. Raj. Kothari. Party system is an indispensable component of modern representative democracy. It provides the necessary framework for the competition of ideas and the negotiation of interests. Subrata. K. Mitra. The party system is a reflection of the diversity and complexity of Indian society. It offers opportunity for different T groups to articulate their interests and participate in the democratic process. Zoya Hassan. The detailed study of the political parties started with the behavioralism in the writings of Duvernay and Robert Michels in his book, Political Parties. Importance of political parties. Political parties are essential for the effective working of modern democratic states. Professor Harrow/Tij. Lasky called political parties as the life and blood of democracy and stated that there is no alternative to party government, save dictatorship, in any state of modern size. Government requires leaders. Leaders require not an incoherent mob behind them, but an organized following able to canalize the issues for an electorate with a free choice. Functions of political parties. 1. Interest aggregation. Political parties unite sectional interest aggregation. Political parties unite sectional interests, bridge the geographical differences, and induce cohesion. The various interests are aggregated through the instrumentality of parties. 2. Nomination of candidates. Political parties contribute to democratic government by nominating candidates for election to public office. In their absence, voters would be confronted with an array of self-nominated candidates, each seeking a narrow victory over others on the basis of personal friendships, celebrity status, or name. 3. Voting choice. They help democratic government by structuring voting choice, reducing the number of candidates on the ballot to those who have realistic chance of winning. 4. Zoya Hassan argues that a party is a keystone political institution in representative regime, and parties regularly fulfill 3 crucial functions. TI1SAR. Nominating candidates for public offices, formulating and setting the agenda for public, and mobilizing support for candidates and policies in an election. 5. Edmund Burke. Political parties are the set of people sharing common ideology, coming together for promotion of national interest. Theories of Part 5 SVSDCMS. 1. Human nature theory. Under IBIS, 3 kinds of explanations have been put forward for explaining the origin of the party system. Firstly, scholars like Sir Henry Maya Levin argue that human beings form parties to give organized expression to their combative instinct. The second category of explanation argues that the diverse temperaments of individuals lead them to form different parties. Third explanation is that since the dormant masses need leadership to articulate their latent feelings, formation of a political party depends upon availability of dynamic political leadership. 2. Environmental explanation. It emphasized the role of the socio-economic environment in the evolution of the party system. It states that the modern democratic party system is the result of 2 significant political developments: the limitation of the authority of the absolute monarchy and the extension of the suffrage to virtually all the adult population. 3. Interest theory. This theory is based on the basic assumption that various parties are formed on the basis of various interests. It argues that the parties serve as convenient agencies for the expression of individual and group interests. Unique features of political parties in India and difference from parties in Western countries. 1. According to Zoya Hassan, political parties in India reflect many unusual features. No concern for ideology. There is a growth of catch-all parties. Rather than policy-oriented, parties are office-oriented, the disconnect between people and parties. Connection between political parties and corporate groups, including among the communist and socialist parties. Some parties have unique nomenclature like AIDMK. None of the parties have any grand design. Z. Views of Paul Brass. Indian parties reflect paradoxical features. There is a blend of Western bureaucratic structure with indigenous political practices and institutions. Political parties lack intra-party democracy. 3. Views of Yogendra Yadav. Political parties in India are going through the process of institutionalization as well as deinstitutionalization. On one hand, their reach is increasing, but on the other hand, the depth and intensity of the voters have been declining. The role of political parties has got reduced to the instrumental act of voting. They have overlooked the broader agenda of a democratic nation and nation building. Evolution of Pi-1Y system in India up till 1967, Congress system, from 1967 to 1977, breakdown of Congress system. From 1977 to 1979, two-party system. From 1979 to 1989, the emergence of a multi-party system. From 1989 till 2014, multi-party democracy system, an age of coalition politics. 2014 onwards BJP dominant party system. Congress dominance era, up till 1967. 1. Views of 1 Vloris Jones. At the time of independence, India bad multiple parties, but the India party system as described by Morris Jones used to be known as a one-party dominant system. 2. Views of Rajni Kothari. The concept of one-party dominance explained India's party system during the 1950s and 1960s. He described the Congress party as Congress system, Congress as a party of consensus, and other parties as parties of pressure. He calls Congress a rainbow coalition as Congress itself was a grand coalition. Congress program incorporated the interest of the different sections of the society. 3. Majority. In Lok Sabha and state assemblies. As the leading party, the Congress had obtained an absolute majority of seats in parliament in the first 4 general elections. The Congress was such a dominant force that it secured comfortable majorities in almost all the elections to the Lok Sabha and the state assemblies in 1952, 1957, and 1962. 4. Demise of J.L. Nehru. After the 4th general election, Nehru's demise and split in the party had affected the Congress dominance in party SYSDM. Even though the Congress was the single dominant party at the center and in most states, it faced competition from the non-Congress parties in several states. Reasons for Congress dominance. Historical legitimacy. Congress became a mass party under the leadership of Gandhiji. It maintained centrist agenda and rejected communalism as well as communism. Accommodation. Jawaharlal Nehru promoted freedom of speech and expression, culture of toleration and accommodation within the party. He showed sensitivity towards minorities was. Paper 1. PSIR optional subscribe from Telegram channel, Shunya notes, 50 Puj 5-4. Successful in convincing the Londian misses that Congress is critical for the survival nation. Others, grassroots organizational presence, its development agenda, Congress was itself a coalition of broad ideological spectrum. Breakdown of Congress system. Loss of majority. From the 4th general election of 1967 onward, there was a decline of Congress party dominance in Lok Sabha elections and assembly elections, and there is emergence of regional parties and leaders. The Congress lost its majority in 9 states. In North India, Bihar and UP, Charan Singh-led parties bearing different names such as BKD, BLD, or LD and Socialists emerged as alternative to Congress. Mundal Commission, 1 L1E introduction of reservation for backward classes in Bihar and UP in the 1970s, and setting up of Mundal Commission to introduce reservation for backward classes in the central government institution are example of agenda which was different from that of the Congress. Bipolarization of political parties. During 1967 to 1989, bipolarization of political parties in the states formed a significant feature of political system. In Tamil Nadu, competition has been mainly between the DMK and the AIADMK. Student movements, besides, split in the Congress in 1969, erosion of the credibility of public institutions during Indira Gandhi's regimes, students' movement led by Jayaprakash Narayan in the I-974 and imposition of emergency, in 1975 to 1977 added to the decline of the Congress. Rise of Janata Party. The Janata Party, which was formed out of merger of 5 parties on the eve of general election of I-977. The defeat of the Congress in this election was considered as the harbinger of a new era in the party system. Since the late L980s, the Congress Party has failed to generate a popular leadership capable of accommodating varied interests and blunting the counterattack of its rivals. In the following decades, while the BJP emerged as the most dominant political party in India, unlike in the preceding decades, the Congress needed allies to retain its influence. /VBV The decline of Congress system. 1. Internal factors, centralization of powers, decline in intra-party democracy, and loss of grassroots support after Nehru's death. 2. External factors. Yogendra Yadav says that the decline of Congress is linked to the deepening of democracy. L5 Democratic upsurge has resulted in OBCS coming out of the party. 2. Democratic upsurge resulted in the Dalits coming out of the party. 3. Green Revolution. Green Revolution and state reorganization, which has resulted in the strength of OBCs and the rise of the regional parties. 4. Sultas Pa/Ashikar says that Congress is not in state of decline, rather 2014 elections mark death of Congress. The number of seats which Congress got in the 2014 election is even less than the number of seats Congress could get after the emergency. He lists down 3 phases of Congress hegemony till L967, confrontation till 1967, and survival from 1989 onwards. Paper I, PSIR optional subscribe from Telegram channel, Shunya notes, 50 page 548. Future prospects of Congress Pratap Banu Mehta argues that the Congress should leave the majority and minority complex. It should know how to make strategic alliances and should emerge as a party of transformation. The party should go back to the role of organizing social movements and should not restrict itself to electoral calculus. Conclusion. Neeraj Chandok argues that there is re-emergence of one-party dominant system with BJP system replacing the Congress system. However, this new one-party system is radically different from umbrella-like Congress. BJP is ideologically oriented with a disciplined cadre. Nature of party system in India since 1989, era of coalition politics. 1. Rise of regional parties. Views of Milan Vasilmov argues that rise of regional political parties is an eternal theme of Indian politics. The rise of regional parties is attributed to institutional factors. Delinking of parliamentary and state elections has given opportunities for regional parties for mobilizing people on local issues. Federal system. The state governments deal with those issues which are of day-to-day relevance, which gives an advantage to the regional parties. Linguistic reorganization of states by given rise to the dominant caste fanning their own regional parties. Social and economic factors. Green Revolution led to rise of intermediate caste asserting their power even in the political sphere. Growing politicization of religion, growing consciousness about rights and democracy, fragmentation of Congress. The suspension of democracy and the introduction of emergencies led to the fragmentation of Congress and rise of regional parties. Views of Paul Brass. Regionalism is a long-term trend, so regional parties are bound to play an important role. Views of Siddha Pai. Regional parties are rooted in regional ground. They should not be seen as a byproduct of regionalism, rather phenomenon in its own right. It is a result of linguistic reorganization, decline in Congress system, and uneven development. Impact of regional parties. Views of Prof. MP Singh. The regional parties led to moderating role of ideology, limited political space for national alternatives, and cutthroat competition, increased corruption, criminalization, defections, and lack of stability. However, he also held that regional parties help to contain separatism and increase choice for electorates. 2. Rise of coalition politics. Meaning of coalition. Coalition is a political arrangement formed by multiple parties to form government in situation of hung assembly. O.W.H. Riker in Theory of Political Coalitions called coalitions as means to gain more power and explained the coalition as /ver sharing arrangement. Professor Ogg defines coalition as cooperative A1 arrangements under which distinct political parties uniteto form a government or ministry. Causes of coalition politics in India. Views of C.P. Bombury. The Congress system itself was a coalition of various classes, communities, and social identity groups. Views of A. Sridharan. He links coalition politics to rise of regionalism and state politics in India because of growing politicization of social cleavages, rise of new classes, India's social heterogeneity, fragmentation of political parties, and democratic deficit in institutions. Views of Sanjay Ruparelia. Divided we govern India's diverse social landscape and institutionalized federal system makes coalition politics natural. Views of Bidut Chakravarti. Jay in his book Coalition Politics in India has analyzed the evolution of coalition system in India. He held that coalition is not new to India. History of coalition in India. Coalition since 1969. Although coalition governments in the states and at the Sinte were formed in 1969 and 1977 led by the SVD alliances and the Janata Party respectively. It was since 1989 that coalition politic became a pattern in Indian politics. Pre- and post-election alliances. Political parties made pre- and post-election alliances. In 1996, 13 non-BJP parties formed an alliance known as the United Front. Some of the parties which formed this alliance included Janata Dal, Samajwadi Party, Dravida Mumitra Kazhagam, Telugu Desam Party, Assam Gana Parishad, and Left Front. Similarly, in 1999 Coalition Government of National Democratic Alliance, NDA, was formed with BJP as the largest member of the coalition. Emergence of multi-party coalition post-2004. The survival of the government depends on the support of one or more parties which have different ideologies and different support basis. 2014 in coalition politics, BJP won 282 seats and created a one-party coalition. Views of Suhas Pa/Shakar. 2014 elections were an aberration and coalition politics is here to stay in India. Views of E. Sridharan. Coalition politics still remains very important in India. In FBTP system, pre-election coalitions and aggregating votes at constituency level are vital to win seats. Ruling party still has to depend on other parties in Rajya Sabha for support. Parties like BJP don't have a pan-India presence, and in order to expand its base, it has to find new allies. Views of Atul Kohli. He argues that the coalition politics has enhanced the federal spirit and led to democratic deepening in India. Consequences of coalition politics. Policy paralysis, decline in post of speaker, frequent elections, defections, and increased role of money and muscle power. However, it also has positive consequences such as inoculation of regional aspirations and making democracy more representative. Desirability of coalition in India. Views of Shruti Rajagopalan. Coalition governments prevent badly crafted ideas rammed down by a strong executive. Thus, India needs coalition governments to check executive of one teach. Views of Professor Torben Iversen in his article titled Electoral Institutions and the Politics of Coalitions, Why Some Democracies Redistribute More Than Others, shows that rise in inequality is slower in countries that have coalition governments because coalition governments redistribute resources proportionately. Sanjoy Hazarika. If politics is the art of compromise, then coalition politics is the chemistry of functional autonomy. Coalition in India may be the most representative and peaceful way of running a nation of such vast diversity, social and economic inequities. There also emerged the alliance of parties excluding the members of the UPA and NDA, especially one LY the Congress and the BJP. This came to be known as the Third Front. But the Third Front has not been a stable alliance unlike the UPA and the NDA. Third Front. The Third Front refers to different alliances established by smaller or regional parties at different stages of time since 1989 to provide a third option to the Indian voters other than Congress and BJP. It is basically an alliance of regional parties with no ideological coherence and is a fluid category that keeps on changing. Third Front formed government at the union level for 2 times. National Front government was formed with the support of BJP in 1989 and United Front government with the support 0F Congress and CPI, in 1996. In 2019 elections, Third Front was formed under Magad Abandon and even Congress was pioted. However, the Third Front could never provide stable government in India and it is only Symbol J where the front emerges before elections and dissolves after elections. Conclusion. The present political landscape, marked by a shrinking Congress party and Invincible BJP, calls for a new coalition of regional forces in India. Classification of parties based on ideological orientation. 1. Left and right parties. The word left and right were initially used in the French Revolution of the 18th century. At that time, France had monarchy. Some people were in support of monarchy and some were against it and wanted democracy in their nation. At that time, the sitting arrangement of France Parliament was in the following way. People sitting on the right side were those who were loyal to their monarch, mainly the wealthy class. People sitting on the left side were those who were poor and were not loyal to their monarch and wanted democracy in their nation. These people were not happy from the monarchy and wanted a revolutionary change in the existing system. 2. People L. said different tag for left-wing and right-wing. Left-wing reformist, revolution, primarily they are liberals, communists, and socialists. Right-wing conservative, establishment, they are conservatives, nationalists, and Republicans. Paper 1. PSIR optional. Subscribe from Telegram channel, Shunya Notes 50 page 551. 3. Classification of political parties in India. Socially right-wing. There are 3 socially right-wing parties in India on the aspects of religion. These are the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, Shiv Sena, All India Majlis-e-Ittihad al-Muslimin, AIM, socially left-wing. Remaining parties are socially left-wing because they are secular parties. These are the Indian National Congress, Inc., AAM, and Dami Party, AAP, Janata Dal United, JDU, All India Trinamool Congress, TMC, Communist Party of India Marxist, CPM, economically left-wing. Almost every party in India is economically left-wing because they support subsidies and want to increase taxes. Ideological changes in political parties. Rise of right in India, from 3 seats in Lok Sabha in 1952 general elections to 303 seats in Lok Sabha currently. Causes for rise of right, decline of Congress, strong organizational strength at grassroots, organizational and leadership capabilities, globalization, NRI support for BJP policies, rise of ethnic politics and growth of middle class in India, the rising fear of Islamic fundamentalism, etc. Views of Thomas Blom Hansen. In Saffron Politics desk knows it as a middle-class phenomena swaying on development agenda, which was insecure from politics of identity after the 2 democratic upsurges. Views of Christophe Frelot. A response from majority to politics of appeasement towards minorities. Views of C.P. Bombury. He argues that rise of right in India is a response to politics of caste. Views of L/Philan Vaishnav. The present Indian politics is a rejection of both minorities and Congress version of secularism and the assertion of majoritarianism in combination with the concern for good governance and development. Views of James Manner. With the decline of Congress, people were left with 2 options, left or BJP. Left ideology lacked imagination. Left also lacked leadership. Right appeared to be a better tie-in from all heirs actives. Short note on Bharatiya Janata Part 5, BJP. Formation. The BJP was formed on April 6, 1980. However, its ideological origins can be dated back to 1951 when Congress politician Shyama Prasad Mukherjee broke away from Nehru's leadership to form the Bharatiya Janata Sangh, BJS. The party was formed in collaboration with the Hindu nationalist organization, Rashtriya Swaramsevak Sangh, RSS, in opposition to the political practices of the Congress Party. Influence. BJP is influenced by cultural nationalism, Gandhian socialism, positive secularism, and integral humanism of Deen Dayal Upadhyaya. Mandate. Preservation of Hindu identity and culture. Founded at a time when the Indian National Congress was practically the face of Indian politics, the BJS could barely be successful in its initial years since. Histo.re. In 1975, when PM Indira Gandhi imposed emergency on the country, members of the BJS held strong protests against the Khan Esri IME. After the withdrawal of the Ernarank. Paper I, PSIR optional. Subscribe from Telegram channel, Shunya Notes 50 page 552. The BJS collaborated with a number of other parties and formed the Janata Party. The Janata Party dissolved soon after, and a large number of its members who were previously members of BJS formed the BJP. The party is currently the largest political party in India, both in terms of representation in parliament and in terms of party membership, has come a long way since its origins in the early 1980s. The BJP has at present formed a robust footing in the Indian political scenario, and significantly overturned the ideological framework that drove India's national and international policies for a long time. 2. Decline of left in India. The 2019 election results marks the death knell of the left in India as a major political force. The share of the left vote, which was at 23% in 1952, has been reduced to under 2.5% in 2019. Causes. The decline of the left in India can be attributed to following reasons. The politics of caste is more potent in India than the politics of class. The left got overwhelmed by other regional powers that articulated regional aspirations in a more effective way. Ideological confusion and closed system of thought. Changing nature of peasant and worker movements. Left agenda hijacked initially by Inc. and now by AAP. Lack of internal solidarity among parties. Dependency on imported doctrines. The principle of democratic centralism, which does not allow dissent and internal debate, has been the factor for weakening of lefty. Lack of leadership. Views of Praful Bidvai. He suggests that the decline of left is an old story. It is surprising that left in India could never take root despite the prevalence of mass poverty. It is also surprising that youth in India is attracted towards right rather than toward left. Left-wing politics never really took off in India. There are many reasons for this. Indian diversity, the conservative Indian character, regional fault lines, caste, the Hindu predilection for order and nonviolence. AAP phenomenon in India is like Syriza in Greece, workers' Pai Thai in Brazil, Tehrik-i-Insaf in Pakistan, and People's Movement in Hong Kong. It emerged out of anti-corruption movement and is also a byproduct of globalization, which has an urban character. AAP describes itself as anti-politics, anti-ideology, and is against power politics. Unique characteristics: bottom-up approach, rejection of a command culture, presence of intra-party democracy, right to recall member of executive council and condition that no two members of same family can contest the election. Nature of Indian parties. 1. Views of Zoya Hassan. Political parties in India reflect many unusual features, which are ideological depolarization. Indian political parties are catch-all parties, and there is no concern for ideology. Office-oriented rather than policy-oriented. The political parties in India are office-conscious rather than policy-conscious. Connection between political parties and corporate groups. Even socialist and communist parties links to corporate groups. No grand design. She argues that none of the party in India have any grand design. Lack of intra-party democracy. In her article, The Question of INH, Party Democracy, she emphasized on lack of institutionalization and presence of oligarchies in Indian parties. 2. Views of Paul Brass. Paradoxical theories. Indian parties reflect many paradoxical features where there is a blend of Western bureaucratic structure with indigenous political practices and institutions. Lack of intra-party democracy. Political parties in India lack INH, a party democracy, and there is nepotism. 3. Views of Yogendra Yadav. Institutionalization and deinstitutionalization. Indian parties are going through the phase of institutionalization, widening allegiance, and deinstitutionalization, less deep allegiances. Role of parties reduced to voting. The political parties overlook democratization and nation-building to gain votes. 4. Views of James Manner. Nearly all of Indian parties are based on loyalty to leaders, rather than loyalty to values or institutions. Parties have become vote-gathering machines, depending on charisma of their leaders. 5. Views of Veer Sanghvi. Political parties have become a closed shop with entry restricted to those having right credentials at birth. 6. Views of E. Sridharan. Since 1980s, the influence of big businesses and corporate houses BAS increased in political parties. Difference between the political parties in developed and developing countries: too weak, personalistic, oppressive. Parties in developing countries depend too much on an individual and is exploitative because of lack of institutional structure and proper legal source of capital influx. Liberal nature of political parties and leaders. Western world is generally more liberal than the emerging democracies. For example, recently in aftermath of a terrorist attack on a teacher, French president reassured all the absolute freedom of expression that's usually impossible in the developing world. Intra-party democracy. Inner positions of political parties in developed countries are held by people elected by the party members themselves, whereas the leadership in political parties in developing is usually dynastic. Mixed ideologies and/or ideologies. Political parties in the developed countries generally follow a clear ideology throughout, but the case with political parties in developing countries is not same. They have a mix and match of all ideologies. Most of the developing countries develop a model around welfarism, and there usually aren't even proper economic right factions. Coalition politics. Coalition politics in developing countries depends upon remaining in power, whereas in developed countries it depends upon the agendas and ideologies. Vidyut Chakravarti also argued that rainbow coalitions are formed in India that are mix and match of ideologies. Difference in agendas. Green energy, climate change, global warming, animal care, vegan lifestyle are some of the agendas of developed countries, whereas religion, community, race remains the agendas in developing countries. Limitations of Indian party system: a well-knit organization, ideology, internal democracy, democratic leadership, and policies and programs are important features of a political parties and democracy. Most political parties in India generally do not satisfy these criteria. Personality of leader. Even though some parties have organizations, all kinds of parties, national, state, or unregistered parties, have rallied behind a personality. Most parties in the states are known by their leaders, not by their policies or the parties as such. Lack of internal democracy. Political parties largely lack internal democracy in which decisions are not taken in democratic way or an individual or group of individuals within the parties take major decisions. Narrow approach. Some parties articulate interests of specific sections of the society, rather than those of the all. Criminalization of politics. There is growing nexus between political parties, criminals, and cannot constitute a limitation of party system in India. Intrapart Democrat in India L views of Pratap Banu Mehta. He points towards impact of poor institutionalization, intraparty democracy, fragmentation of the party system, and the prospect of perpetual coalition governments. Weakening of democratic accountability despite high turnover of incumbents. Political parties are unable to transcend their narrow social bases and become parties of principle. The less internally democratic a party, the less likely it is that the relevant information will flow up party conduits. This will not allow the free and uninhibited flow of relevant information. 2. Views of Kanchan Chandra. The relative lack of intra-party democracy within the Congress in UP compared to Karnataka during the 70s prevented it from incorporating newly mobilized backward caste groups. Dynastic succession works as insurance against defections and fragmentation of political parties. 3. Views of Ruchika Singh. She points that absence of intra-party democracy has contributed political parties becoming closed autocratic structures with increasing fragmentation within parties. Selection of poor electoral representatives and growing criminalization and abuse of financial power in elections. Pressure groups 1. Meaning of pressure groups. Pressure group are associations with common economic, political, cultural, or religious interests that exert pressure on political system to shape policy making in their advantage. They are an integral component of pluralist democracies. Duverger, most pressure groups are non-political organizations, and pressure politics is not their primary activity. Any group, association, or organization, even those whose N01 malconcerns are far from politics, can act as pressure groups in certain areas and under certain circumstances. S.E. Feiner, the pressure groups are, by and large, autonomous and politically neutral bodies, which bargain with the political parties and the bureaucracy irrespective of the political complexion of the government in power. 2. Role of pressure groups in policy making. Expertise to government. The pressure groups provide expertise and information to the government. For example, the Indian Medical Association protested to have a central law to deal with cases of incidents of violence towards doctors. Needs of minority. The pressure groups help in expressing the views and needs of minority groups that remain unheard. Example, the issues related to the protection of culture and languages are addressed by the Tamil Sangha and Andhra Mahasabha. Brings government attention. Pressure groups attract the attention of the government on important issues. Example, the Bar Council of Delhi supported farmers' protests against farm bills and organized protest meetings. Safety valve. Pressure groups act as a safety valve in the democracy to vent out the pressure of people. Example, Nirmada Bachao Andolan, a women's right organization, act as a vent to the primary issues of the environment and women. Agents of political socialization. Pressure groups are agents of political socialization insofar as they influence the orientations of the people towards the political process. Example, the Tanoa League of Assam, United Mizo Federal Organization influenced people and government. Agent of political development and political modernization, as studied by Professor Rajni Kothari. Pressure groups act as agencies for political socialization, political recruitment, and political communication. 3. Scholar views on pressure groups. Rajni Kothari. Indian pressure groups have a mix of Western and non-Western features. The pressure groups have been agents of modernization and reservoirs of leadership. Miriam Weiner in Politics of Scarcity highlights the emergence of communal pressure groups in India such as RSS, Jamaat-e-Islami, Padada Anamat Andolan Samiti. Robert Hardgrave says that the nature of pressure groups is evolving, gaining legitimacy, become influential in policymaking, are reservoirs of political leadership, and becoming agents of modernization. Gabriel Almond, he calls them interest articulators in political system. Samuel Feiner has called them anonymous empires, act as unofficial governments, and legislature behind legislature. PAPR-L, PS, are optional. Subscribe from Telegram channel, Sunyanox 50 page 556. Alan R. Ball. Pressure groups are firmly part of the political process in that they attempt to reinforce or change the direction of government policy, but do not wish, as pressure groups, to become the government. Professor Anand Chakravarthi. He argues that if government of India has shown accommodative stance WRT pressure groups, it would have been easier to address alienation and secessionist trends. 4. Difference between pressure group and political parties. The political parties perform the function of interest aggregation, whereas pressure groups have a role of interest articulation. Further, the pressure groups remain outside from the government offices and pressurize from outside, whereas political parties join political institutions/government institutions. 5. Tools used by pressure groups to pressurize political parties. 6. Writing open letter, which influences public opinion. Electioneering. Placing in public office persons who are favorably disposed towards the interests the concerned pressure group seeks to promote. Lobbying. Persuading public officers to favor their interests in policy making. Strikes. Through temporary stoppage of work, a pressure group tries to coerce those who are responsible for satisfying interests. Propagandizing and mass media. using social media and mass.s media to change public opinion in their favor. 6. Changing in a Turk of pressure groups in India. Robert Hardgrave and Stanley Kohanik H. Lesthonby highlighted the changing nature of pressure groups in India. Since 1990s, pressure group politics is shifting from state-dominated pluralism to more powerful pressure group politics. Pressure groups started gaining legitimacy as a result of liberalization and globalization. There is a substantial increase in the power of business groups such as FICCI, ASSOCHAM, and CII. Electoral behavior 1. Milan Vaishnav. The study of electoral behavior in India is a challenging task because of size and diversity. While voters may harbor deep-seated social biases, identity-based concerns, and economic evaluations are both in play. Good economics can make for good politics in India too. Kenneth Arrow Impossibility Theorem. In case of elections, it is difficult to determine the preference when voters have more than 3 choices. 3. David Butler. India decides the voting behavior of Indians is many times more mature than voting behavior in Western countries. 4. Professor M.P. Singh. The success of Indian democracy goes to the great common sense est. Ho/VN by Indian voters. 5. Kanchan Chandra. In India, survival goods are allocated through political markets. 6. Mukulika Bain 1G and Mary Breeding. Why India votes. People participate in voting as assertion of citizenship right and duties, power inversion, revenge, good work of Election Commission of India, and as edifice of Democro Y maintained. Paper 1. PSIR optional subscribe from Telegram channel, Shunya Notes 50. Indians give a lot of importance to their vote. Elites vote as a sense of duty towards nation, while poor are more pragmatic voters. 7. Trends in electoral behavior. Center for the Study of Developing Societies, growing share of youth population as voters, importance of caste and religion as the TEM 1 inning factors, limited influence of developmental policies. Corruption and anti-incumbency does not matter. No difference in preferences of man and woman, rural and urban. 8. Views of Yakendra Yadav. People in India are moving from identity politics to identity plus politics. LT includes concern for identity as well as development. 9. Pranoy Roy, Aspect Labori, David Butler, in a compendium of Indian elections, argue that the voting behavior of Indians is many times more mature than the voting behavior of voters in Western countries. Major determinants of voting behavior. Language and ethnicity. These were the major determinants till 1967. The ink tied to gamer votes on the lines of language as seen from the process of linguistic reorganization on India post-1956 with the creation of Andhra Pradesh, where the state residents were demanding a separate state based on Telugu. Ink showed the stand of accommodative politics. Role of caste. LT forms mosaic of Indian politics as argued by Christoph Jaffrelot in his work Religion, Caste, and Politics in India, 1998. Emergence of parties like BSP, SP, RJD, etc. underlines significance of the marginalized castes playing decisive roles in electoral politics. Gender. Since the 1990s, the participation in voting in elections of the marginalized sections, or plebeians, including women, has increased significantly. Leadership and charisma. After India's general election of 2014, political analysts coined the term Modi wave to depict the phenomenon of a strong leader who managed to obtain a major gain in a landslide victory. Local factors. The CSDS surveys have portrayed that the voting behavior in India has started falling on the regional grounds again. Subhas Palshikar in his article Local Factors, Detem 1 INE Electoral Outcomes in States argued that state elections are fought on local factors. Socioeconomic profile of legislators. It is important to the credibility of any representative democracy that its citizens feel that their legislators are truly representative of their interests. Socioeconomic and political profiles become important in this context. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar stated that the working of Constitution, however good or bad it may be, will depend on those who are called to work on it. Edmund Burke described legislature as the microcosm of the society. The representation of the sections of society in legislatures should tell about the principles of due representation. Sultankar and Rodriguez in the Indian Parliament. Democracy at Work classify the changing profile in 3 phases. Phase L, Phil 4 TB General Elections Brahm.in Domination, Women, and Backwards Allowed. Paper I, PSIR Optional I subscribe from. I Telegram channel, Shunya Notes 50. Themselves to be represented rather than representing themselves. High education standards, dominated by lawyers and agriculturalists. Phase 2, from 1970s, 90s known as Twilight Zone or Transition Zone. It has been described by the Yogendra Yadav as first democratic upsurge, which has resulted in OBCs coming out of the party. Phase 3, from 1990s phase of plebeianization domination of OBCs and rise of Dalits, second democratic upsurge, plebeianism, entry of commoners, dominated by agriculturalists and social workers, criminalization of politics. Profile of parliamentarians of 17 Lok Sabha, PRS, 1. Educational qualifications. 394 MPs have at least graduate level education. In the 17th Lok Sabha, 27% of MPs have studied till 12th class. In comparison, 16th Lok Sabha had 20% MPs who had studied till 12th class. Profession profile of IPs. Since 1996, at least 75% of representatives of each Lok Sabha have been graduates. 2. Age and term. A.I.C. LK-Dari. Zithpa. A. Alc 11D Sokaser A. Leo / Fewer MPs over 70 years, more MPs under 40 years. The average age of an MP is 54 years. 12% of MPs below the age 40 years. This is more than that of the 16th Lok Sabha. WMCH had 8% of MPs below the age of 40 years. On average, women MPs are 6 years younger compared to male MPs in the 17th Lok Sabha. 3. Representation of women. 716 women candidates contested TE general election. Out of WMCH, 78 women MPs have been elected to the 17th Lok Sabha. In 2014, 62 women MPs were elected. The representation of women MPs in Lok Sabha is slowly improving from 5% in the first Lok Sabha to 14% in the 17th Lok Sabha. Though the percentage of women MPs has increased over the years, it is still lower in comparison to some countries. These include Rwanda, 61%, South Africa, 43%, UK, 32%, USA, 24%, Bangladesh, 21%. 4. Economic and profession profile. 39% of MPs have listed their occupation as political and social work. 38% are engaged in agricultural activities. 23% MPs are businessmen. Christophe Jafferclot and Gilles Vernier annals 1S of 17 LS profile. With 78 women elected out of 542 seats, 14.6%, India stands at the unenviable global rank that of 141 with regard to women's representation in national parliaments. The upper caste accounts for 28 to 29% of all MPs, against 23% of OBC MPs and 14% of intermediate caste MPs. Lok Sabha is an assembly dominated mostly by Hindu, disproportionately upper caste. A. Paper 1. PSIR optional. I subscribe from I Telegram channel, Swinotes. 50 page 559. Significant number of whom belong topological families. Comparative analysis. Friends in socioeconomic profile of legislators. 1. Social. Education level -1 SD to 17th Lok Sabha. Educational qualifications shows a positive trend, with at least 75% of representatives of each Lok Sabha since 1996 have been graduates. PRS legislative research. This is important for maintaining the intellectual diversity of the House, for healthy deliberations on issues of public importance, and for the quality of laws. Plus AI, dash dot comma, dash dot comma dot comma dot dash dot comma dot a comma, J, comma dot, R dash, comma, MMG. Average age of members has increased from dash 46.5 years in SD Lok Sabha, LS, 1952 to 57, to 54, T, LR, SEC. Taduates a postgraduates 2 doctorates. Years in 17th LS, while the country is among the youngest in the world with a median age of about 28 years. Ot women NPs in Poral, M. and T. Although Oman representatives in Lok Sabha have increased from 5% in 1st LS to 14% in 17th, this number can hardly claim representation for half the citizenry. 2. Economic. Increase in /VLI parliamentarians. On the occupation aspect, although 77% of MPs in 17th Lok Sabha have declared political and social service, 39%, and agriculture, 38%. As their occupation, 475 members are corruptity, according to Association for Democratic Reforms, ADR. Uttar Pradesh case. The rise of wealthy candidates is clearly visible from the recent election results in Uttar Pradesh Assembly. According to ADR, out of the 403 winning candidates and up, 366 candidates' individual wealth share is more than 1 crore rupees. Views of L/Philan Vaishnav. In When Crime Pays, 2017, he notes increasing influence of money in politics is causing criminality in politics, with about 43% of lawmakers in 17 LS having criminal cases against them, up from 30% in 15th LS. Views of Nilanjan Sarkar. Notes the rise of money in politics leads to corruption and abuse of public office after candidates come to power to ensure return on investment, money in elections. 3. Political. Views of Sudha Pai. In TB Indian Parliament, 2014. She notes that while increasing numbers of rich and powerful have made legislators more exclusivist, increased members from various regional and non-Congress parties in past 3 decades have made the House more. Paper I, PSIR optional. Subscribe from Telegram channel, Sunyanox. 50 page 560. Inclusive vis of vis social identities. Significance of inclusive legislature. Political equality. An inclusive legislature comprising all sections of society protects the rights of all the sections of society by their selected representatives. Social justice. It will lead to political inclusion of diverse elements of the society in the legislature by giving them representation. It ensures political justice even to the most vulnerable sections of the society, such as SCs and STs. It ensures political justice even to the most vulnerable sections of the society, such as SCs and STs. Shift in politics of ideology to politics of representation. The representation of people leads to the assertion of their identities in the legislature. Tackle legitimation crisis. Inclusive parliament creates legitimacy among the minorities and vulnerable sections of the society, which negates any legitimation crisis. Standard conclusion. In a truly democratic system, parties should be able to function as inclusive institutions. What? Marginalized sections of society can find representation. Neeraj Chandhok. A well-functioning party system is necessary for the effective functioning of democracy. A. Provides citizens with meaningful choices and holds governments accountable. Zoya Hassan. For a party system to be inclusive, it must not only provide representation to diverse groups but also ensure their meaningful participation in decision-making processes. Yogendra Yadav. The success of a party system depends on its ability to accommodate the diverse interests and aspirations of the people it represents and adapt to changing circumstances. Sanjay Kumar. An inclusive and democratic party system can be a powerful tool in bringing about social and political change by promoting active citizen engagement and empowering marginalized groups. Suhas Palshikar. Our representative institutions embody the idea of democracy as popular self-government. In the long term, the quality of legislation, effectiveness of the parliamentary system, and the survival of democracy itself depends on how representative and thus credible our representatives are. Unit 11. Social movements. Civil liberties and HL/Ian Wright's movie I/T Leontius previous white cars questions. I. Examine the nature of civil liberty movements in I.Dia, 2022. Comment on Tuesday Dilanunas of the Human Rights Movements in India, 2014, 3. Explain how peasant movements promoted nationalist ideas during the struggle for Indian independence, 2014, 4. In what ways do civil liberties and human rights movements influence the varking of Indian democracy? Give our answer with suitable exam less. 2010 social movement is a collective term used to describe all enterprises that establish a new style of life. They are a faun of collective behavior in which the motive to act springs from attitudes and aspirations of members acting within an organizational framework. It is a collective mobilization of people towards some collective goals. Standard introduction. 111 Human rights movement in India has been critical I-11 promoting and protecting the rights of marginalized communities. It has been I-11 STMI 11 TAL in bringing to the forefront issues such as police brutality, custodial violence, and discrimination against women, Dalits, and minorities. Na 11 Dita Hoxar. Civil liberties and human RZGHTS movements in India have challenged the unequal distribution of power and resources in society. These movements have sought to empower the marginalized and create a more just and inclusive society. Rajiv, B.L. Argava. The civil liberties and human rights movements in India have been a source of inspiration for many struggling for justice and equality across the world. The movement has shown that collective action and mobilization can bring about significant change even in the face of repression and violence. M.Rari Roy. The civil liberties and human rights movements in India have been instrumental in shaping India's democracy and its commitment to protecting the rights of all its citizens. The movement has challenged the state's abuse of power and strengthened India's constitutional from L11 org, making it more responsive to the needs of its people. Sultab 11 M. Hashmi. Origin and evolution of social movements. Origin. The term social movements was introduced in 1850 by the German sociologist Lorenz von Stein in his book History of the French Social Movement from 1789 to the present, 1850. British abolitionist movement. According to Charles Tilly, social movements did not exist before the late 18th century. The British abolitionist movement has some claim to be the first social movement. French Revolution. Political movements connected to French Revolution are one of the first documented social movements. Rise of labor movements. The J9th century labor movements can be seen as prototype social movements, which has led to the formation of communist parties and organizations. Emergence of new social movements. The new social movements emerged in 1970s in form of women's rights, peace, civil rights, and environmental movements. Characteristics of social movements: collective behavior. A considerable number of persons must be involved in an activity for it to be considered as a social movement. Shared objectives and ideology. A social movement is consciously organized and planned activity of individuals having common interest. Those participating in a social movement have shared objectives and ideologies. Minimal degree of organization. A social movement must demonstrate a minimal degree of organization. The organization of social movement may be loose, informal, highly institutionalized, or bureaucratized. Extend beyond community. Only when local activities have spread across several communities and events do they become movements. Change-oriented. Social movements have as their objective some form of change in the way people think, in what they believe, and in their behavior. Political activity. Majority of social movements are characterized by political activity and by people of a broad range of social backgrounds. Various thinkers on social movements. Herbert Blumer. Social movements can be viewed as collective enterprises to establish a new order of life. They have their inception in the condition of unrest and derive their motive power on one hand from dissatisfaction with the current form of life, and on the other hand, from wishes and hopes for a new scheme or system of living. Graham Wallace. A social movement develops out of a deliberate, organized, and conscious effort on the part of members of society to construct a more satisfying culture for themselves. Professor Y. Singh, social movement is a process of collective mobilization of people in a society in an organized manner under an individual or collective leadership in order to realize an ideologically defined social purpose. Jürgen Habermas and Alain Terreo. New social movements were the products of a social formation where the welfare state had made classic forms of exploitation and deprivation obsolete, but where modern society created new forms of alienation. Types of social movements, old social movements. The modern social movements started in the West as a reaction against the exploitation of the working classes. Workers' movements were the earliest social movements. They are now known as old social movements. New social movements. The social movements which started in West in 1960s are known as new social movements. These movements are concerned with developmental issues and quality of life issues such as environmental movements, human rights movements, civil rights movements, peace movements, etc. Paper 1, PSIR optional. Subscribe from Telegram channel, Stminotes 50 Puj 563. Differences between old and new social movements. Objectives. The old social movements deal with bread and butter issues, whereas new social movements deal with quality of life issues like sustainable development. Class composition. Old social movements are the movements of lower classes, workers, or disadvantaged sections, whereas new social movements are primarily the movements by middle classes. Leadership. For both old and new social movements, the leadership has primarily come from the advanced sections of middle classes. But it does not mean that lower classes have never provided the leadership. Techniques. Old social movements primarily used political techniques. They take direct action to gain political and economic powers. Whereas, new social movements use multiple mediums like art, literature, theater, nukad natak, movies, etc. Organizational structure. Old social movements refer to established parties and interest groups. New social movements emphasize on the decentralization and participatory decision-making ideology. The classification based on Marxist theoretical framework, focusing on class structure of the participants with ultimate objectives to overthrow the present state aiming at bringing total change in production relation, is considered as old social movement. New social movements and their ideological stance is linked to new left. Approaches to stud socia movements. Relative deprivation theory. It was introduced by American scholar Denton Morrison, who guided some studies on agitations and mass movements. Deprivation theorists believe that social movements are temporary aberrations and not an ongoing processes of change. Resource mobilization theory. It attributes importance to the effective use of resources in promoting social movements, since a successful movement demands effective organization and tactics. Jenkins and Perot argued that protest and movement formation only occurs when the necessary resources are pumped into it. Marxist approach. Conflict is central core of social movements and class struggle is central driving force for resistance. They argue that members of same class not only have common interests vis-a-vis other classes, but also share common consciousness for their position in society that they share common interests. This helps their collective action against ruling classes and state. Civil liberties. 1. Definition. Civil liberties are a broad spectrum of liberties that are necessary for a civilized existence of the human beings. 2. History of civil rights movements in India. Largest civil rights movement. Indian freedom struggle was not just a movement for independence, but it was the largest civil rights movement starting from Raja Ram Mohan Roy to the taking over by Mahatma Gandhi of the nationalist movement. Issues of civil liberties were taken up both in various forums and movements and agitations. Result of Western education. In India, civil rights demands grew through the impact of Western liberal ideas on the educated middle class. Paper L, PSIR optional. Subscribe from Telegram channel, Sunyanox 50 page 564. Demand for basic freedoms. Most important demands of moderates were related to reforms in legislative councils. Their expansion and greater representation were some of examples of civil rights movement. Struggle for civil liberties was conducted essentially along constitutional lines. But agitation against Rowlatt Act turned into mass movement. Establishment of Indian Civil Liberties Union. Jawaharlal Nehru established Indian Civil Liberties Union on November 7, 1936. Constitution of India. Indian Constitution is perhaps first constitution which incorporates spirit of human rights. Fundamental rights are available even to non-citizens. It also has a scheme of social and economic rights in form of directive principles of state policy, DPSPs. Article 22 provides protection to person detained under preventive detention. Post-independence, 1970s, there was decline in rule of law and rise of overdeveloped state. This was a new phase of civil rights activism marked by growth of anti-price agitations. Jayaprakash Narayan called for total revolution. He even called for armed forces not to obey the orders of the government. Imposition of emergency. Government imposed emergency on the ground of internal disturbance. It called for committed bureaucracy and committed judiciary. Emergency was darkest hour for India's democracy. However, democracy has survived, and there was proliferation of civil rights organizations like Citizens for Democracy, Association for Democratic Reforms, ADR, People Union for Civil Liberties, etc. 3. Philosophical basis. Civil rights are based on the philosophy of liberalism. Its basic purpose is to check the arbitrary exercise of power by the executive and to maintain the rule of law. 4. Anti-authoritarianism. Civil rights are the primary requirement of liberal democracy and involve struggle against authoritarianism and totalitarianism, whether local or foreign. 5. Personal assurances. Civil liberties are personal assurances and freedoms that the government cannot curtail, either by law or by judicial interpretation without due process. 6. Rights covered. Political thinkers generally agree on the following liberties as the most important ones for a civilized existence: liberty of the person, freedom from arbitrary arrest and detention, and security against punishment without trial under the rule of law, liberty of movement within the territory of the state, security of private property, freedom of conscience, including the profession and practice of religion as we use as atheism, liberty of opinion and expression of opinion, including the freedom of holding assembly and of the press. Human rights IVOMITS. 1. Meaning. Human rights refer to the concept that every member of the human race has a set of basic claims simply by virtue of his humanness. They are the rights claimed in respect of all human beings as human beings. They are called human rights because they are no longer derived from operations of natural reason but what is called human. 2. Theme of human rights. Differences between old and new social movements. Objectives. The old social movements deal with bread and butter issues, whereas new social movements deal with quality of life issues like sustainable development. Class composition. Old social movements are the movements of lower classes, workers, or disadvantaged sections, whereas new social movements are primarily the movements by middle classes. Leadership. For both old and new social movements, the leadership has primarily come from the advanced sections of middle classes. But it does not mean that lower classes have never provided the leadership. Techniques. Old social movements primarily used political techniques. They take direct action to gain political and economic powers. Whereas, new social movements use multiple mediums like art, literature, theater, Nukhad Natak, movies, etc. Organizational structure. Old social movements refer to established parties and interest groups. New social movements emphasize on the decentralization and participatory decision-making ideology. The classification based on Marx's theoretical framework focusing on class structure of the participants with ultimate objectives to overthrow the present state aiming at bringing total change in production relation is considered as old social movement. New social movements and their ideological stance is linked to New Left. Approaches to stub social movements. Relative deprivation theory. It was introduced by American scholar Denton Morrison, who guided some studies on agitations and mass movements. Deprivation theorists believe that social movements are temporary aberrations and not in ongoing processes of change. Resource mobilization theory. It attributes importance to the effective use of resources in promoting social movements since a successful movement demands effective organization and tactics. Jenkins and Perot argued that protest and movement formation only occurs when the necessary resources are pumped into it. Marxist approach. Conflict is central core of social movements and class struggle is central driving force for resistance. They argue that members of same class not only have common interests vis-a-vis other classes but also share common consciousness for their position in society that they share common interests. This helps their collective action against ruling classes and state. Civil liberties. 1. Definition. Civil liberties are a broad spectrum of liberties that are necessary for a civilized existence of the human beings. 2. History of civil rights movements in India. Largest civil rights movement. Indian freedom struggle was not just a movement for independence, but it was the largest civil rights movement. Starting from Raja Ram Mohan Roy to the taking over by Mahatma Gandhi of the nationalist movement, issues of civil liberties were taken up both in various forums and movements and agitations. Result of Western education. In India, civil rights demands grew through the impact of Western liberal ideas on the educated middle class. Paper PSIR optional I subscribe from. Telegram channel. Shunya Notes 50. Demand for basic freedoms. Most important demands of moderates were related to reforms in legislative councils. Their expansion and greater representation were some of examples of civil rights movement. Struggle for civil liberties was conducted essentially along constitutional lines. But agitation against Rowlatt Act turned into mass movement. Establishment of Indian Civil Liberties Union. Jawaharlal Nehru established Indian Civil Liberties Union on November 1936. Constitution of India. Indian Constitution is perhaps first constitution which incorporates spirit of human rights. Fundamental rights are available even to non-citizens. It also has a scheme of social and economic rights in form of directive principles of state policy, DPSPs. Article 22 provides protection to person detained under preventive detention. Post-independence, 1970s, there was decline in rule of law and rise of overdeveloped state. This was a new phase of civil rights activism marked by growth of anti-price agitations. Jayaprakash Narayan called for total revolution. He even called for and forces not to obey the orders of the government. Imposition of emergency. Government imposed emergency on the ground of internal disturbance. It called for committed bureaucracy and committed judiciary. Emergency was darkest hour for India's democracy. However, democracy has survived, and there was proliferation of civil rights organizations like Citizens for Democracy, Association for Democratic Reforms, ADR, People Union for Civil Liberties, etc. 3. Philosophical basis. Civil rights are based on the philosophy of liberalism. Its basic purpose is to check the arbitrary exercise of power by the executive and to maintain the rule of law. 4. Anti-authoritarianism. Civil rights are the primary requirement of liberal democracy and involve struggle against authoritarianism and totalitarianism, whether local or foreign. 5. Personal assurances. Civil liberties are personal assurances and freedoms that the government cannot curtail, either by law or by judicial interpretation without due process. 6. Rights covered. Political thinkers generally agree on the following liberties as the most important ones for a civilized existence: liberty of the person, freedom from arbitrary arrest and detention, and security against punishment without trial under the rule of law. Liberty of movement within the territory of the state. Security of private property. Freedom of conscience, including the profession and practice of religion as well as atheism. Liberty of opinion and expression of opinion, including the freedom of holding assembly and of the press. Human rights movements. 1. Meaning. Human rights refer to the concept that every member of the human race has a set of basic claims simply by virtue of his humanness. They are the rights claimed in respect of all human beings as human beings. They are called human rights because they are no longer derived from operations of natural reason but what is called human. 2. Theme of human rights. Universal rights. They are said to be universal rather than national and are different from legal rights. They are claims that belong to everyone regardless of any provisions that may or may not exist for him in a particular state. Inalienable. Human rights can be taken away from person. The possession of these rights make a difference between human existence and mere animal existence. Not absolute. This view is more difficult to sustain since in practice rights are often balanced against one another. For example, does the assertion of a right to life rule out capital punishment and all forms of warfare? 3. Constitutional and statutory provisions related to human rights. Fundamental rights. These include the right to equality, right to freedom, right against exploitation, right to freedom of religion, cultural and educational rights, saving of Sue 1 laws and right to constitutional remedies. Directive principles of state policy. These include right to social security, right to work, to free choice of employment, and protection against unemployment, right to equal pay for equal work, right to existence worthy of human dignity, right to free and compulsory education, equal justice and free legal aid, and the principles of policy to be followed by the state. Statutory provisions. Protection of Human Rights Act, 1993 provided for the constitution of a National Human Rights Commission. 4. Human rights movements in India pre-independent India. Views of Nilanjan Dutta. Ti1 demands for civil rights in 1 Daya deny back to the 19th century when educated sections of the subject population, Mandid, EQ. Equality of opportunity and employment, freedom of press, and the ability of racial Equality of opportunity and employment, freedom of press, and the ability of racial discrimination in legal proceedings. Bombay Session of Inc., 1918 at the special session of the Congress. A Declaration of Rights was adopted and presented to the British government with a view that these rights would be made a part of the new Indian Constitution as promised under the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. Declaration at Kanpur Convention, 1925. It diversified the nature of rights demanded. These now included not just political and civil rights such as the freedom of speech, expression, and assembly, but also social and cultural rights such as free primary education, freedom of conscience and religion, gender equality, and others. Establishment of Indian Civil Liberties Union, 1936. The union was presided over by Rabindranath Tagore while Sarojini Naidu was the first working president. The activities of the ICAU included exposing and investigating various instances of police atrocities and custodial violence, suspension of citizens' rights, and incarceration of political prisoners. Human rights movements in 1960s. Human rights movement lost steam immediately following India's independence. Regionally fragmented attempts. The first group was the Civil Liberties Committee, CLC, established in Bengal. Its formation was largely the effort of the communists who revived the struggle for human rights in 1948 by leading mass movements. Rise of Naxalite movements. The two states where the movement was at its strongest and therefore state repression the most burnt were Andhra Pradesh and West Bengal. Consequently, the Andhra Pradesh Civil Liberties Committee, APCLC, was established in 1974. The Association for the Protection of Democratic Rights, APDR, was set up in Calcutta in 1972. Emergency period. Pressure from social inconvenience. The last quarter of the 20th century has been witness to a growing recognition of the place and relevance of human rights due to pressure from various social movements. The Randi shock received from the imposition of the national emergency in India in 1976 made the articulate and vocal sections of society sensitized to human rights. Growth of HR organizations such as Citizens for Democracy, People's Union for Civil Liberties, PUCL, People's Union for Civil Liberties and Democratic Rights, PUCLDR, and Chhatra Yuva Sangh, Arshviyahini were at the forefront of human rights struggles at the national level. Human rights movements during 1980s. Contribution of women's movement to human rights movement. Nationwide anti-rape campaign in 1980 resulted into emergence and proliferation of the autonomous women's organizations in several cities and towns of India. Public interest litigation. Civil society working with judiciary BAS led to the beginning of A and 1/4 WFISE of human rights activism. Activist judges like P.N. Bhagwati institutionalized PL. PL proved to be a revolutionary step in providing access to justice to marginalized sections. Nirmada. Bacheo Andolan, the voices were raised by NBA activists against Sardar Sarovar Dam constructions on Nirmada River for the rights of the Tambal people. Liberalization. 1991 The instances of human rights violations have not reduced in the I-990s in spite of an increase in number of and multiple causes that human rights groups are advocating. Increase in number of advocacy groups. Globalization has increased the number of advocacy groups in India. It has resulted in various international NGOs like Amnesty International opening their offices in India and have actively participated in human rights movement. Reportage of human rights violations. Liberalization of the communication sector, particularly in the arena of visual media, has helped to not only expose government excesses but also provide impartial and wide reportage of human rights violations. Rights of domestic workers. Human Rights Law Network, YUVA, and College of Social Work. Mumbai prepared domestic workers bill to regularize terms and conditions concerning work condition and wages of the domestic workers who happen to be women from the depressed classes. Establishment of MBRC, 1993 increasing use of human rights protection as a foreign and economic policy instrument by developed nations such as UPSC. And pressure applied by international NGOs such as Amnesty International led to the setup of National Human Rights Commission in 1993. Views of Upendra Baxi, liberalization has led to emergence of human rights markets. Human rights markets are said to comprise a series of transactions across a range of economic actors that pursue competition within a framework of collaboration. The instances of human rights violations and suffering must be commodified or packaged in a manner that the mass media can easily market to its consumers. Situation of internal conflicts. Jammu and Kashmir. Since insurgency began in JNK in 1989, there have been 10,000 unofficial and 4,000 officially declared disappearances, including in arable instances of encounter and custodial deaths, rapes, and torture. It has been estimated that 55,476 Kashmiri Pandit families remained displaced in Jammu and Delhi since the 1990s. Northeastern states, about 200,000 Bodos. Muslims and Adivasis remained displaced in the Bodoland areas of Assam since 1994, while there were 44,000 indigenous Karbis and Dimsis in camps in the Karbi Along district of Assam. Misuse of acts. Under the cover of various acts such as the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, AFSPA, Disturbed Areas Act, the Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Act, TADA, and Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, UAPA. The security forces have acted with impunity both de facto and de jure with scant deference to citizens' rights or fear of legal prosecution. Naxal movement. The persistence of the movement suggests that economic and social deprivation and discrimination continue to plague rural India, and that is the government's agenda of providing social justice has failed. The Naxalites enjoy large-scale support in the countryside. Osalwa Juda movement. Chhattisgarh. It has officially been claimed to be an anti-Naxalite uprising of villagers who want to end the violence brought on by the Naxaj. However, many human rights groups argue that the movement is largely a state-sponsored initiative. It has provided the government with an opportunity to displace villagers and place them in refugee camps on the pretext of protecting them against Naxalite-driven violence. Contemporary human rights movements. Views of Upendra. Many concerns are now being expressed in the language of rights, demanding legal and social recognition. The right to livelihood, right to compensation and rehabilitation for injuries caused by state agents or agencies, right to speedy trial, right to education, etc., which have gained the status of judicially recognized fundamental rights on account of judicial interpretation in PL. Campaign against communalism. There have been increasing instances of communal riots in almost all parts of the country, the most gruesome being the Gujarat genocide of 2002. The killing of Graham Staines and his sons in Orissa was another gruesome aspect of communalism. Human rights groups committed to secular humanism are exposing the communal game and expressing solidarity to the survivors of violence at the hands of sectarian vested interests. NHRC Annual Report, 2002 to 2003. The report dealt with 542 reported instances of caste-related atrocities. Instances of failure to take action, police excesses, unlawful detention. Paper PSIR optional. Subscribe from Telegram channel. Shunya Notes 50 page 568. Flash implication, dowry death, custodial violence, and illegal arrest were the other categories that topped the list of human rights violation in the report. Diverse human rights movements. Upendra Baxi argues that there is no nationwide human rights movement in India. There are only diverse human rights movements which cling onto their specialized areas of human rights advocacy. Membership to these groups is often plagued by voluntarism. Farmers' suicides. Farmers' suicides are the most tragic and dramatic symptom of the crisis of survival faced by Indian peasants. Since 1997, 2 lakh farmers have committed suicide. Navbania has started a Seeds of Hope campaign to stop farmers' suicides. Right to food. PUCL petition on hunger in Rajasthan in the Supreme Court in 2001 snowballed into emergence of the Right to Food campaign that highlighted key issues such as making the right to food a fundamental right, converting all existing schemes into entitlements, tackling large-scale malnutrition, and securing employment as a fundamental right linked to the right to food. 5. Different views of scholars. Upendra Baxi. Human rights movements in India face the challenge of legitimacy crisis. We find human rights industries in India rather than human rights movements. These organizations act with corporate approach rather than attitude of social service. Bansham Shah. Human rights movements began since 1970s in India. These movements have a diverse and autonomous character, class, Naxalbari, women, towards equality, LGBTQ, NAS Foundation, tribal, Samada, Andhra Pradesh, Dalit Panthers, Environment, and Student Perspectives. Nandita Hasker, HR movements in India had to work within defined limits. Indian state does not tolerate any activism going beyond the pertinent of national discourse. Rajni Kothari describes HR movements as non-party political formations aimed at keeping a check on the state. Amita Bhaviskar, many of these human rights movements are embedded in global networks and alliances, like Amnesty India's campaign on recompensation for Sikh riot victims and strict laws for women. 6. Human rights concerns in India, large number of under trials. As much as 76% of inmates are under trials, which is the highest in 25 years. These are poor people, Dalits, poverty-stricken people who are unable to furnish bail bonds and continue to rot in jails for years without their cases being taken up. HR violations by armed forces under FSBA demands to repeal the controversial law following the Nagaland firing incident, which claimed over 14 lives in December 2021. Misuse of preventive detention laws. Frequent misuse of preventive detention laws against political opponents. As per NCRB, there is a rise in preventive detentions in 2021 of about 23% compared to 2020, with over 1 lakh people being placed under preventive detention. Caste and religion-based violence. Cases registered for crime against SCs rose from 42,793 in 2018 to over 50,000 in 2020, and of crime against STs from 6,528 to 8,272 in the same period. 7. Challenges faced by human rights movements. Paper L, PSIR optional /subscribe from /Telegram channel. Shunya Notes 50 page 569. Global capital. State remains a willing ally of the domestic and multinational corporate sector, and thus the human rights groups must face the challenge of global capital, which is not shackled by the concerns of social responsibility. Various dilemmas. Human rights movement rights group. Global capital. State remains a willing ally of the domestic and multinational corporate sector, and thus the human rights groups must face the challenge of global capital, which is not shackled by the concerns of social responsibility. Various dilemmas. Human rights movement rights groups are expected to oppose various kinds of violations of human rights by the state. On the other hand, they must also work within the state's legal framework to demand justice. Curbing of dissent. According to Rajni Kothari, with the rise of a technocratic state committed to global capitalism, there has been large-scale depoliticization and curbing of dissent. The distinction between state and civil society has blurred, with the latter lacking any agency or alternative perspectives to the ones championed by the state. L11E character and structure of the human rights community are radically changed since the post-emergency period, when India saw the first human rights movement emerge after independence from British colonial rule. The government needs to give greater powers to NHRC with respect to violation of human rights by members of armed forces. There is also an urgent need for police reform, 1S, prison reforms, judicial reforms, criminal justice system reform, etc. Conclusion. The human rights movements are fighting both religious chauvinism and market fundamentalism politically and ideologically. They are promoting secular Hui-11anism and voicing the concerns of the oppressed, suppressed, and blameless human beings. Their commitment to human rights is not based merely on individual rights, but that which includes GEL's co-flecti.ye rights of the people. Women's movements. Previous year's questions examine the scope and limitations of women's movements in India. 2014. Point out and comment on the historic importance of the document Towards Equality, 1974, for women's movement in India. 2013. Women as individuals and as a group are among the most discriminated sections in India as well as in th. world. The socio-cultural discrimination imposed on them has the consequence of women being relegated to what Simone de Beauvoir termed as the second sex. The enormity of the discrimination faced by women and denial of basic constitutional and human rights began to coalesce around feminist consciousness, thus providing backdrop to the emergence of the women movements. Standard introduction. 17 i.e. women's movement has made women aware of their rights and potential. It has exposed the deep-seated patriarchal attitudes and practices prevalent in our society and has been instrumental in bringing about legal and policy changes for women's empowerment. Geeta Sin, Indian eco-11omist and women's rights activist. The women's movement in India has been a significant force in bringing about changes in attitudes, behaviors, and policies towards women. It has challenged the traditional patriarchal structures and norms that have been oppressive to women or centuries. Kumari Jayward 11a. 2. Sunyas. Srila 11 Ka 11 Femi 11 scholar. The women's movement in India has been instrumental in raising awareness about gender-based violence and discrimination. It has also been successful in advocating for legal reforms, such as the Criminal Law Amendment Act 2013. Which provides for harsher punishment for crimes against women. 11. Nivedita Menon, Indian feminist scholar. The women's movement in India has played a crucial role in creating spaces for women's voices and perspectives to be heard and acknowledged in public discourse. It has also helped in building solidarities across diverse social groups and movements. 11. Uma Chakravarti, Indian historian and women's rights activist. The women's movement in India has been a powerful force in challenging the gendered power tours that operate within society, politics, and the economy. It has been an agent of change and transformation, not just for women, but for society as a whole. 11. Raka Ray, Indian sociologist and gender studies scholar. Views of different scholars. Simone de Beauvoir, women movements aim to dismantle the shackles of the oldest and most prevalent forms of hegemony in the world, patriarchy, on the second sex. Neera Desai, the women movement is the organized effort to achieve a common goal of equality and liberation of women, and it presupposes sensitivities to crucial issues affecting the life of women. Gail Oemvelt, she classifies women movement into two types: women equality movements, aim to abolish open remnants of feudal patriarchy, and women liberation movements, challenge the sexual division of labor. Jana Everett classified the women's movements on the basis of two ideologies of feminism: corporate feminism, claim a larger role in politics for women, and liberal feminism, equal rights to women as men. Fada Kishwan, the only achievement of women movement has been some bizarre pieces of legislations. Neera Desai and Usha Thakur, women movements face challenges of identity, division along caste and religion, and the women issues are not just women issues. Anupama Roy, the foundations for Sri Swadhinta during colonial period saw women as passive recipients of reform measures by male reformers. Sumita Sen, women movement is hugely divided on the lines of CTE, religion, and the solidarity and sisterhood lacks. There is a need for viable and feminist politics and transformative agencies going beyond class, caste, and religion. Ramala Thapar, the identity politics has dealt a death blow to women's movement in India. Politicization and co-option of women's issues by the political parties has meant the loss of autonomous character of the women's movement. Women movement in India before independence. The coming of the British and the Christian missionaries presented a big challenge to the local intellectuals and social leaders. They have attacked the indigenous society and its treatment of women and brought paper L, PSIR optional. Subscribe from www.sunniios.c01n Telegram channel. Shunya Notes 50 page 571. Blueprint for NE/L, organizing principle for the society. Role of intelligentsia. The women's movement in India began as a social reform movement in the 19th century, started by liberals such as Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Ishwar Chandra Vijayasagar. Due to their efforts, the British government has brought legislations like Widow Remarriage Act, Prevention of Sati Act, and Sharda Act for Lingam Panchalu, Jyotiaba Fulu, Badruddin Tabaji. Dadabai Naoroji led the movement greatly to the cause of women education and more public space. Women organizations. The prominent women organizations which led the movement for the cause of women are Women's India Association by Annie Besant, National Council of Women in India, and All India Women Conference, which was set up in 1927. Gandhian era. In the 1920s, the Gandhian movements brought back a sense of unity on the women's question. The national movement created the largest possible space for the women to come out and increase their participation in the public sphere. Impact of Russian Revolution. The success of Russian Revolution encouraged a large number of women to join the communist movement in India, who were involved in the national movement and women's movements at the same time. Women movement post-independence 1. Phase 1 up till 1970s. Appama Mahanta calls these years as gray areas of women movement. Constitutional provisions. To Constitution of India BAS given equality of status to women, equal rights including right to vote and to stand in elections. Article 15, 3, makes it possible for the state to create special provisions for protecting the interests of women and children. Article 16 provides for equality of opportunity for all citizens in matters relating to employment or appointment to any office under the state. Article 42 directs the state to make provision for securing justice and humane conditions of work and for maternity relief. Article 51A(e) enjoins upon every citizen to renounce practices derogatory to the dignity of women. Role of communist parties. The communist parties, since 1950s, not only provided women leadership but also kept the women's question in the center of political discussion. However, with the split in the communist movements in 1964 and emergence of many new voices within the left movement, new ideas and organizational principles to articulate demands of communities and groups began to emerge. Example: Spahata movement, Indaliya district of Maharashtra. Extension of franchise. Women got franchise, the democratic right, and the development would see that she got the economic rights to practice that democracy. Thus a full-blown theory of equality, rights, and justice was in place. Anti-dowry and rape movements. The violence towards women in form of bride burning and rape galvanized the women's movement since the 1970s. The campaign against dowry and rape are called the first campaigns of the contemporary Indian feminist movement. Limited participation in anti-price rise and anti-liquor movements. Paper PSIR optional. I subscribe from Telegram channel. Shunya Notes 50 page 572. Women rights organizations like SUA, 1972, and Sarnagra Mahijag Bade came into existence. 2. Phase 2, 1970s and 1980s, phase of revival and activism. Prominent issues. The prominent women issues in 1980s were dowry deaths, rape incidents such as Mathura, Sati incident at Diarala, and Shabanu judgment. UN Decade for Women, 1975 to 85. The year 1975 was declared as the World Women's Year by the United Nations. The decade witnessed women-related activism by feminist groups as well as political parties. It has directed government to prepare the report on status of women. Committee on Status of Women. It published the report with the title Towards Equality 1974. It pointed out the declining sex ratio, gender-based violence, discrimination, and declining participation of women in political and economic sphere and recommended to constitute watchdog body like National Commission for Women. Change in approach of government. The process changed from welfare to development, and there is growth of women organizations including Organization of Muslim Women like Majlis, Awazin Iswan. Organization of Dalit Women like All India Dalit Women Conference. Introduction of gender component. Since 6th five-year plan, the government has introduced gender component in each plans. Shabanu Affair, 1985. It showed the weakness of the women's movement to mobilize its strength to fight for a common civil code and brought the weakness of the progressive sections in the society to come forward and demand uniform civil code for AI the community so that the women's rights come out of the domain of religion into the secular legal cornane. Dalit movement and feminism. It was also during this time that Dalit movement and feminism. It was also during this time that Dalit movement and feminism got linked. A Mahila Samaj Sainik Dal 2 was formed by some Dalit groups in Maharashtra. Views of Uma Chakravarti, two different opposing perspectives emerged on women's struggles. First, saw women issues as a part of larger mass struggles, while the second saw women issues as autonomous of mass issues. 3. Phase 3-1990 SG, Oath of Feminist Movements. By 1990s, new trend emerged due to worldwide GRMBTH of feminist movements. The nomenclature of women organization was changed, and they became more inspired by radical feminism. The new names adopted were Saheli, Vimakana Manushar, Jaggery, etc. Division in movement. Towards 1991, women movement started getting divided on the line of caste and religion. The Indian politics from 1990s got shaped more by caste and religion, and that women issues also get mixed up. No party affiliation. The women groups which emerged post-70s decided to keep themselves women-only group without any party affiliation. By 2000, thousands of such groups working in different parts of the country, and in fact the Indian women's movement by 2000 is characterized more by these groups across the country than by the organizationally structured movement as such. 4. Post-LPG reforms, prominent issues, sexual abuse, Nirbhaya and Me Too cases, right to better reproductive menstrual health, maternity benefits and abortion, equal claims to inheritance and PSIR PSIR optional / subscribe from / Telegram channel. Shunya Notes 50 page 573. Education, challenging patriarchal cultural practices, Sabarimala issue, etc. 5. Present. Movements changing status. The period is marked by changing patriarchal social and political status like exception for marital rape in Section 375 of IPC. Focus areas, improving health, nutrition, and educational status, stronger laws on women's security and enhanced social equality. Bhumida Brigade's efforts on temple entry. Ukalpagam. India has been home to some of the most diverse and creative women movements of past decade. Anupama Roy. The recognition of differences of caste, Vikas Vanchit Dalit Mahila Paris had, religion, sexuality, etc. has given critical reflexivity to women's movements, thus deepening their quest for substantive equality. New social movements, survival and dignity have become the twin issues, which these movements have infused to the already existing issues of equality and justice. Some of the examples include participation of a large number of women in the movement for the rights of labor in the tribals in Chhattisgarh by the CW1 Adiskar Mukti Morcha, in the Nanada Bachayo Andolan, and the agitation against the authorities in Banwari Devi case where the authorities were trying to shield the oppressors. Challenges for / women movements. Division in the movement. Women movement are divided on sectarian, class, caste, religion, lines. The issues of Dalit, tribal, and minority women are usually subdued under larger narratives. Mabukishvar says that too much energy goes in international fora where conferences and / single quote workshops have substituted real work. Anupama Roy. Irrespective of women's activism, political parties have been desultory in prioritizing, promoting, or giving importance to women issues. Issue of women reservation in Parliament and Assembly. Different views. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. He argued that the reservation compromises merit and if introduced it cannot be rolled back. Sarojini Naidu. Reservation will impact confidence of women. Women can be elected on basis of their merit. Towards Equality Report. 1974 it opposed reservation in Parliament and Assembly and favored reservation in local bodies. Its approach was reformative rather than radical women issues. Elabad of Sua. Economic empowerment of women should be the focus and not reservation. Sharon Rai, a feminist scholar, opposed reservation as it does not serve purpose. She gives the example of Pakistan. Pakistan National Assembly BAS are reserved seats for women, but it does not mean that it has resulted into improvement in the status of women. Feminist scholars Keenan and Laura, they support women reservation as women representation has been stagnant, and they view that women are not elected does not mean that they are not talented. Not all members present in Parliament are on basis of merit efficiency. Reservation to women will make democracy more inclusive in general terms, and it will be empowerment measure. PSIR optional subscribe from Telegram channel. Shunya Notes 50 page 574. Women reservation in panchayats. The 73 CAA introduced reservation for the women in panchayats with the V1S10 in that political empowerment will be a means to achieve the other form of empowerment. Views and support. Rohini Pandey. Reservations for women have reduced prejudice against female leaders. Gabrielle Crux-Wisner. Reservation in Panchayat BAS been a key for women's social mobility. Esther Duflo and Ragwindra Chattopadhyaya. Districts with female Sarpanch/Pradhan. Greater investments are made in drinking water, a priority public goods issue for women. Views in opposition. Sadhapai. Reservation will not lead to true empowerment of women, but it will give rise to patty panchayats. Ripa Committee Recommendations 2012. 1. National Policy for Women. It suggested a national policy for women and an action plan to end violence against women. 2. Draft new national women policy. Based on this committee recommendations, government has prepared a draft new national women policy. The major highlights are, it aims to create sustainable socio-economic, political empowerment of women to claim their rights and entitlements, control over resources and formulation of strategic choices and realization of the principles of gender equality and justice. Broad objective is to create a conducive socio-cultural, economic, and political environment to enable women enjoy de jure and de facto fundamental rights and realize their full potential. It has suggested dependent care and child care leave not for just working women, but working men too. Conclusion: like several other social groups, Indian women also have been involved in social movements before and after independence. Amrita Basu, in Two Faces of Protest, says that even though there are divisions in women movements, they remain the strongest force of social justice and change. There is a need to reinvent the spirit of Nari Shakti and tackle the problem of sexual politics. Kate Millett, in Dialectics of Sex, Shula Smith Firestone. Environmentalist movements, previous year's questions. Write short note on the significance of Chipko movement. 2019. Examine the various causes of agrarian crisis in India. 2018. Critically analyze the environment movement in Tuticorin, Tamil Nadu. 2018. Comment, compare, and contrast Chipko movement with Nirmada Bachao Andolan. 20I3. Discuss impact of environmentalist movement on government policies in recent years. 2012. The environmental movements have challenged the policy and pattern of economic development in Ost and India. Anal ZE with exam less 2009. Environmental and ecological movements are an important examples of the collective actions of several social groups. These movements in general are grouped under tribal and peasant movements and under. Paper 1. PSIR optional. I subscribe from I Telegram channel. Sunya 50 pinch 575. New social MO emits as ecological aspects are generally associated with peasant and tribals whose sun rival is associated with the state of natural resources like forests, water, etc. Ramik Bandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil in Ecology and Equity call them as social movements to effect changes in laws and policies towards sustainable use of natural resources, halting environmental degradation, and bringing environmental restoration. Further, R.C. Guha stated that there has been no single unified and homogeneous environmental discourse in India, calling it as varieties of environmentalism. Standard introduction. Environmentalism is not an option, it is a necessity. The E11 Viro, 11 Me, 11 Tailist movements aim to protect our planet from further damage and preserve it for future generations. 11. VA, 11 Dana Shiva. Environmental movements are important because they create awareness about the negative impacts of human actions on the environment. They strive for sustainable development, balancing human needs with environmental protection. Simila Narain, the environmentalist movements are a response to the rapid degradation of the natural world caused by human activities. They aim to protect biodiversity, combat climate change, and promote ecological balance. David Suzuki, environmentalism is not just a movement, it is a way of life. It encourages us to live in harmony with nature, to respect the earth and all its inhabitants, and to ensure a healthy planet for future generations. 11. Wangari Maathai. E11 Viro 11 mentalism is not about fighting against progress, but rather about fighting for a better future. The environmentalist movements seek to balance economic development with environmental protection to create a sustainable future for all. Al Gore. Origin of global environmental movements. Rachel Carson work. The global environmental movements started in 1960s with the publication of book The Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. UN Conference on Human Environment. The concerns of human environment received spectacular attention following the conclusion of the United Nations Conference on Human Environment, Stockholm, in 1972. Environment movements in North America. By the 1980s, the Green Movement became a worldwide phenomenon encompassing various countries of the world. It is signified by movements such as Eco-Greens or Green Movement in Germany and North America. Bistorv of environmental movements in India, Genesis. Tribal movements can be considered as earliest environmental protests in India. In 1921, Mulshi Satyagraha under the leadership of Senapati Bapat against the construction of dam in Lonavala Hills to supply power to the rising industries in Mumbai is earliest protest against dams. In modem sense, environmental movement can be traced to the Chipko movement, 1973, in Garhwal region in the new state of Uttarankal. Period of 1970s and 80s. The L970s and 1980s is marked by struggles around issues of rights of communities in forest resources, sustainability of large-scale environmental projects like dams, and issues of displacement and rehabilitation. Paper I, PSTR optional subscnal, E from, Telegram channel, Sunya Notes 50 page 576. Conventional environmentalism. Formation of national parks, sanctuaries, protected areas represents the conventional environmentalism which the Indian state advocated with the aim of preserving wildlife and biodiversity by pushing people out of these areas. In response, the environmental movement advocated the ideology of environmentalism of the poor. Involvement of disadvantaged. Anushka in West, the environmental movements in India mainly involve women, the poor and disadvantaged masses who have been directly affected by or are victims of environmental degradation. Views of Ramchandra Guba. 3 events initiated the environmental discussion in India, i.e. Project Tiger, B.B. Vora's article on land degradation, A Charter for Land, and the Chipko movement. He has given 4 phases in evolution of environment movements. Phases of environmental movements in India. 1. Phase 1, in 1970s. Age of environmental innocence. Indian environmental movement originated since Chipko movement. Environmental movement was seen as interloper, which attempted to break the consensus when environmental movements were seen as the luxury of rich nations. Conservation of nature was considered as luxury of rich nations. Environmentalists like Chandi Prasad Bhatt, Sundarlal Bahuguna were projected as CIA agents. Marxists in India believed that ecology is a bourgeoisie concept. 2. Phase 2, in 1980s. Growth of environmental consciousness. This was the phase when environmental journalism started by persons like Anil Agarwal, Shekhar Pathak, and N. A. Jespegde. Government has established Department of Environment in 1980. 3. Phase 3, in 1990s. Professionalism in environment movement. The social scientists and natural scientists started producing the credible data, looking for the roots of environmental conflicts. 4. Phase 4, 1990s onwards. Backlash against environmentalism. Once government has adopted neoliberal model based on private capital, environmental protests against mining, SEZ were seen as anti-developmental, anti-national. Environmentalists were termed as old-fashioned socialist guys. Popular environment movements in India. India is a basket case of environmental issues. In words of Ramik Bandra Go. Polluted skies, depleted forests, displaced peasants and tribal is what we see as the result of the 40 years of environmental movement in India since Chipko. 1. Chipko movement, 1973. The origin of modern environmentalism and environmental movements in India can be ascribed to the Chipko movement in the central Himalayan region in the early 1970s. It is a TT-hugging campaign by S.L. Bahuguna Ratna. Paper J, PSIR optional. I subscribe from Telegram channel, Shunya Notes 50 Pinch 577. Sunyas. Its major demands are complete stoppage of cutting trees for commercial purposes. Traditional rights should be recognized on the basis of minimum needs of the people, and making the arid forest green by increasing people's participation in tree cultivation. Women of Advani village of Tarigarwal tied sacred thread Arayu 11D trunks of trees, and they hugged trees. Hence it was called the Chipko movement, or Hug the Tree movement. The major impact of the movement is it prompted the Union government to amend the Indian Forest Act, 1927, and introduce the Forest Conservation Act 1980, which says forest land cannot be used for non-forest purpose. Impact is not limited to India and Global South. Even Japan had similar movement in MT. Takao. The movement caught the imaginations of groups concerned with the environment in countries such as Switzerland, France, Mexico, Denmark, Australia, Canada, and Malaysia. R.C. Guba opines that Chipko was a powerful statement against the violation of customary rights by state forestry, which brought into focus a wide range of issues regarding forest policy and the environment debate as such. Ratna V. Reddy. Chipko had in it the traditional Indian values of natural preservation. Vandana Shivrit stands out as eco-feminist movement. It was a struggle to recover invisible, I.E., value of natural resources and right of women. 2. Apiko movement / Apiko Shalavali, 1983. Inspired by Chipko movement, the villagers of Western Ghats, in the Uttar Kannada region of Karnataka, started Apiko Shalavali movement during September-November 1983. Aim: movement against felling and commercialization of natural forest and ruin of ancient livelihood. The movement /vast successful in its threefold objectives: protection of the existing forest cover, regeneration of trees in denuded lands, and utilizing forest wealth with proper consideration to conservation of natural resources. It created awareness among villagers throughout Western Ghats about ecological danger posed by commercial and industrial interests to their forest, which was the main source of sustenance. It revived the Gandhian way of protest and mobilization for sustainable society in which there is a balance between man and nature. 3. Nirmada Bachao Andolan, NBA, 1985. NBA led to the growth of new type of consciousness in Indian environmental movement. It began as a human rights movement for rehabilitation, but turned into an anti-dam environmental movement challenging the development model. It underlined the importance of people's right to information, which the authorities finally had to concede under media and popular pressure. Used innovative tools, Jal Samarpan, Rasta Roko, Jal Satyagraha, etc. Achievements of movement include forcing international donors like World Bank to pull out of project, forced government to take resettlement and rehabilitation issue more seriously, and has strengthened Indian environmental movements such as protest against Tari Dam at Vishnuprayak, Uttarak Band, against Subansiri Dharn, Arunachal Pradesh, etc. Ratna V. Reddy. It was the largest ever environment crusade in India. 4. Save Silent Valley Movement, 1978. The movement was started by Kerala Sastra Sahitya Parishad, KSSB, an NGO, and the poet activist Sugatha Kumari. It is aimed to protect the Silent Valley, the moist, evergreen forest from being destroyed by a hydroelectric project. Bowing to unrelenting public pressure, in November 1983, Silent Valley Hydroelectric Project was called off, and in 1985, PM Raj for Gandhi formally inaugurated the Silent Valley National Park. 5. Jola Andolan, Fighting Polythene. This is a movement that was started to protect the nature, save water, create greenery, reduce the use of polythene, and promote eco-friendly products. 6. Urban-based environmental movements, industrialization and environmental pollution. In the recent past, environmental pollution caused due to industrialization has become the focus of collective action by the civil society organizations, NGOs, and social activists. The environmental tragedies like gas leakage in Bhopal-based Union Carbide MNC, Chernobyl in former Soviet Union created worries among the people on the negative effect of the industrialization. Growing awareness in 1960s, all major cities of India are facing acute air, water, and other kinds on environmental pollution. Continuous immigration of people from rural areas into the cities and unplanned expansion of cities have created levels environmental hazards. The intervention of the judiciary forced the state to introduce some measures for prevention of environmental pollution. Justice Krishna Iyer, Justice Kuldeep Singh, and Advocate MC Mehta have made remarkable contribution in protection of the environment. Case study of Delhi. Delhi is one of the most polluted cities in the world. Air pollution caused due to the vehicular and industrial pollution and water pollution in Yamuna River BAS made people, especially children and old, vulnerable to multiple diseases. The introduction of the CNG vehicles has resulted in the reduction of the environmental pollution in the city. 7. New Age environmental movements. Definition: New environmental movements refer to the emergent trend of environmental movements in response to destruction caused by new industrialization. They are based on post-materialist ideology, which aim at solving quality of life issues. Features: decentralized leadership, right to environment as against livelihood-centric approach. They harness new age technologies of JCD, social media, and digital mass media. Examples: Save RE Forest Movement, Climate Action Strike Movement, Save Sundarbans movements, etc. are some examples. Examples of environmental movements. Categories: issues equals forest and right of access to forest resources, Chipko, Apico, tribal movements, all. Land-based, non-commercial use of natural over the country, e.g. Jbarkhan/Bot-R resources belt. Prevention of land degradation, social justice/human rights, marine, ban on traveling, preventing. Paper 1. PSIR optional. I subscribe from Telegram channel. Shunya Notes 50 page 79. Resources and fisheries, aquaculture. Industrial pollution. Development projects: A. Dams and irrigation projects. B. Power projects. C. Mining. D. Industrial plants/railway or airport projects. E. Military bases. Wildlife sanctuaries. Commercialization of shrimp and pond culture, protection of marine resources, implementation of coastal zone regulation, stricter pollution control measures, compensation, prevention of reckless expansion of industries without considering design, locational factors and livelihood issues of local population, protection of tropical forests, ecological balance, destructive development, rehabilitation and resettlement of the displaced. Zahiro Gas Morcha in Bengal, Ganga Mukti Andolan in Bihar, movement against Harihar Polyfiber Factory in Karnataka, movement against pollution of Sainver by Vidishak Group Karkhana of Shatdol, MP. Movements against poisoning of Kaliyar in Kerala by Kerala Shastra Sahitya Paris had KSSB Silent Valley Movement by KSSB, Nirmatha Bacheo Andolan, movements against Terry Dam by Terry Bond Virodi Samiti, Koshi Gandhak Bodgatan Beti, Bhopalpatnam and Kampali M West, Tugapadra, Malaprabha and Gaprabha schemes in South, Kona Project Committee. Ecological balance Jan Andolan against Enron and Dabhal. Rehabilitation and resettlement of the Kokero Jan Sangathan in Bihar, anti-displaced mine project in Doon Valley. Depletion of natural resources. Land degradation, ecological balance, realignment, rehabilitation and resettlement of the displaced. Ecological balance, rehabilitation, resettlement and safety. Anti-bite mine movement, Balco project, in Orissa. Protests and demands of Kakana Railway Realignment Action Committee Citizen Group against DuPont Nylon 6.6, Goa, Amravati Bacheo Abhiyan against a large chemical complex. Anti-missiles test range in Baliapal and Netrahad in Bihar. Displacement, resettlement. Rehabilitation and Ekjut in Bimas Banker region of Maharashtra, Shramik Mukti Andolan in. Paper I, PSIR optional. I subscribe from I Telegram channel. Shunya Notes 50 page 580. Sunvias. National Loss of Livelihood Sanjay Gandhi National Park, Bombay Parks. Tourism, displacement, cultural changes, social Himachal Bakbao Andolan, Baliangpo Il Sad, Goa. Advocacy, policy inputs, stricter measures for society for clean cities, Bombay groups/protected areas natural history Soci Thai, BNHS, Center individual clear policy on national parks and for science and environment. CSE. Campaigns, sanctuaries, lobbying research, training and documentation citizens and documentation on wildlife organizations like Bombay Action Conservation, Education, Community Environmental Action Group. Save Groups-Based Environmental Management, Bombay Committee, Save Pune Publications on Environmental Issues Citizens Committee, etc. Appropriate, International Debates, Raleigh City, Anna Hudres Technology / Sustainable Development, Eco-Friendly Village, SOAPCOM, Laurie Baker's Organic Models of Development Housing Pyramids. Farming, Low Cost, Environment-Friendly People Science Institute, Dehradun Housing and Technology. Differences in environmental movement in South and in Western countries. Ramik Bandragua calls the environmental movements in the Western countries as full stomach, whereas in developing countries as empty stomach. -1. Environmental movement. IAS in South, led by poor and tribals whose livelihood are threatened. Example, Chipko movement was not about protection of forests, it was about livelihood. It was assertion by the locals over their right to use the forest wealth. Example, Dongriya Khan's movement in Nyam Jairi Hills of Odisha. Environmental movement in developing countries like India, Brazil have overlapping features. They have the features of both old and new movements. Environmentalism is led by judiciary working with civil society, judiciary recognizing right to life and pollution-free environment as a part of right to life. In South, the movement is primarily guided by Gandhian and leftist ideologies. People go for protest and satyagrahas. 2. Environmental movements in Western countries, led by scientists, come under category of new social movements. Environmentalism in South is empty stomach. Environmental movements in Southern countries are utilitarian and conservationist. The movement in North is institutionalized with many green parties according to Sunita Narain. Environmentalism of North is conservative protectionism, whereas environmentalism of South is conservative utilitarianism. In North, the movement is for sake of environment, but in South the movement is for the sake of livelihood. Paper L, PSIR optional / subscribe from / Telegram channel. Samaya Notes 50 page 581. Challenges / weaknesses of Indian environmental movement. BV Sunita Narain. Firefighting approach. Environmental activism in India is limited to specific projects and lack comprehensive approach. Environmental groups lack proactive approach in pushing public policy, rather they go for firefighting approach. Lack of resources. TI1E civil society in India lack resources and expertise to understand the complex and technical aspects. Lack of transparency and accountability. The approach of Indian government is technocratic. It has to understand that environment is not only planting trees and protecting tigers, but it is about democracy, i.e. democratization of development, involvement of people, and utilizing the reservoirs of traditional knowledge of communities. Lack of green parties. India lacks green parties, though Delhi government has started taking initiative. Lack of state sensitivity. Killing 12 people in protests at Sterlite Copper Factory, Thupakudi. Rapidly growing population. It is accentuated by bureaucratic corruption and incompetence. Economic globalization, based on global rules shaped by interest of North. Others, bureaucratic apartheid, corruption, and crony capitalism. Views of different scholars. 1. Vandana Shiva and Jayant Bandyopadhyay, Political Economy and Ecology Movement. India's development path has been a resource-intensive one and has seriously disrupted the ecological stability and life support systems existing for centuries. 2. Sunita Narain. Environment is not about saving tigers and planting trees. Government needs to look at its current development strategy, which is neither pro-environment nor pro-poor. Environment is about democracy. Environmentalism is not against economic growth. It is only about looking at both people and development differently. She has given the concept of new environmentalism. Environmental movement are about resisting modification and monopolization of natural resources. It is resisting inequitable distribution. It is resisting unsustainable use, and finally, it is resisting the exploitative power relations and resisting disempowerment of communities. 3. R.C. Guba and Madhav Gadgil, Fishered Land, Ecological History of India. They have advocated for people empowerment, proper valuation of natural resources, and knowledge dissemination. 4. Arundhati Roy, she draws parallel between big dams and big bombs. Conclusion. Environmental and ecological movements became prominent in India since the 1970s, like other such movements. The concerns of these movements are not confined to any particular groups but all-encompassing the entire village and urban communities, women, tribes/s, peasants, middle classes, and nature. They have successfully created public awareness about the importance of keeping balance between environment and development. Su 11 Eden Narain has called for new environmentalism to link idealism with purpose, integrating environment and economic agenda. Paper 1. PSIR optional. Subscribe from Telegram channel. Shunya Notes 50 page 582. Order now at. Check sample at our center. Index. Part A. Unit 1. Political Theory, Meaning and Approaches. 2. Unit 1. Political Theory, Meaning and Approaches.